Definitions, genres, and forms. Perhaps the most striking thing about comedy is the immense variety and range of its forms. Historically, these forms have included narrative poems and plays, novels and short stories, commedia erudita and commedia dell'arte, slapstick and the comedy of manners, the jig, the droll, and the afterpiece, and pantomime, flyting, and farce. Even within the more restricted fields of cinema and television, comedy is, and always has been, marked by its formal diversity. From the variety show to the short, from the sketch to the narrative feature, from cartoons to sitcoms and from double acts to stand-up routines, the range of forms it can encompass is probably greater than that of any other genre. Given that this is the case, any single definition of comedy, or any definition of comedy based on a single criterion, is bound to be limited in application, and therefore insufficient. This is true even of definitions based on the criterion of laughter. For while the generation of laughter seems to be the only element common to forms as different as sitcoms and stand-up routines, and to films and television programs as diverse in structure and content as The Good Life, Rowan and Martin's A Laugh-In, The Philadelphia Story, 1940, A Night at the Opera, 1935, Cops, 1922, Screwball Squirrel, 1944, and The Rory Bremner Show, there are occasions when things are not quite so straightforward. For example, a number of comedies, like Going My Way, 1944, or It's a Wonderful Life, 1946, or The Apartment, 1960, are only intermittently funny, and seem designed as much to make us cry as to make us laugh. Equally, many films, The Big Sleep, 1944, El Dorado, 1967, and Stakeout, 1987, among them, contain plenty of funny lines and funny moments, but are not conventionally categorized as comedy. These instances point to the fact that the generation of laughter is not always enough, in and of itself, to define a film, or a television program, as a comedy. Other criteria can come into play. This is borne out if we turn to the dictionary for a definition. The Concise Oxford Dictionary, for instance, begins its entry on comedy as follows: comedy, n. stage play of light, amusing and often satirical character, chiefly representing everyday life, and with happy ending, cf. Tragedy. This entry usefully highlights a number of points, not only about the multiplicity of criteria comedy can involve, but also about the contexts in which those criteria have often been formulated and comedy traditionally defined. The first thing to note is that laughter as such is not even explicitly mentioned, though amusing is perhaps an obvious synonym for it. More important is the fact that criteria of content and structure are specified, in addition to criteria of affect and tone, and that equal emphasis is laid upon them. A comedy is not just light and amusing, it is marked also by a happy ending and by its concern with the representation of everyday life. This has always, in the West at least, been considered an important aspect of comedy. From Aristotle on, and in contrast to tragedy, a contrast marked by the entry itself, comedy was for centuries the most appropriate genre for representing the lives, not of the ruling classes, of those with extensive power, but of the middle and lower orders of society, those whose power was limited and local, and whose manners, behavior, and values were considered by their betters to be either trivial, or vulgar, or both. Silent gag films, the tradition of slapstick, the Carry-On series, television performers like Arthur Haynes and Benny Hill, and sitcoms like Steptoe and Son Until Death Us Do Part are all evidence of the continuing relevance of this particular convention. However, it is worth stressing that the dictionary marks this convention as neither universal nor definitive. Comedy is only chiefly concerned with the representation of everyday life. The comedy of manners, many of Shakespeare's comedies, As You Like It, for instance, and Twelfth Night, films like Forbidden Paradise, 1924, and Holiday, 1938, and television programs like To the Manor Born and Yes, Prime Minister, all of them centered on ruling or upper-class characters, or ruling or upper-class life in general, are evidence of that. So too, of course, as a corollary, are films like Looks and Smiles, 1981, or Death of a Salesman, 1985, and programs like Edna, The Inebriate Woman, which represent lower-class characters or everyday life within a generic context quite different from that provided by comedy. It is worth pointing out, though, that in these instances it is very often the case that upper-class life is represented in its more private, and therefore more everyday and trivial, aspects. A happy ending, meanwhile, is also a crucial, but partial, convention. Usually, as in films like Moonstruck, 1987, or in television programs like The Cosby Show, it exists alongside, and in combination with, other key conventions, such as the consistent generation of laughter through the multiple use of gags, funny lines, and funny situations, and, in these instances at least, the representation of lower-class characters and everyday life respectively. The characters in Moonstruck are mostly of Italian immigrant stock. The family in The Cosby Show is resolutely professional and middle class, but the program centers on what it marks as the ordinary misunderstandings, conflicts, and routines of everyday domestic existence. However, in certain instances, like those cited above as examples of films marked only intermittently by funny moments, a happy ending can be the primary, occasionally, even, the only, convention involved. In these instances, comedy can come surprisingly close, in its concerns as well as in many of its structural features, to the genre we tend now to think of as melodrama. Thus, but for the intervention of God, a comic angel, and a happy ending, It's a Wonderful Life, centered as it is on a man who comes to feel so trapped by the pressures and circumstances of his life that he contemplates suicide, would be a melodrama about the frustrations of domesticity and small-town existence. But for a happy ending, The Apartment, concerned as it is with a man who falls in love with his boss's mistress, would be a melodrama about unrequited love. The kinship between comedy and melodrama is evident not just in isolated, individual examples, but in a whole tradition of genteel or sentimental comedy exemplified by films like State Fair, 1933, Steamboat Round the Bend, 1935, and the various versions of Little Miss Marker. It is evident, too, in various strands of romantic comedy, particularly those in which a melodramatic crisis is resolved by means of a happy ending. Examples here include Why Change Your Wife? 1920, The Shop Around the Corner, 1940, and The Goodbye Girl, 1977. This generic kinship has its origins in the theory and practice of high bourgeois theatre in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. A new hybrid genre emerged at this time in a number of European countries. It tended to feature characters of a lower rank and status than those appropriate to tragedy, and the domestic settings, romance plots, and happy endings of comedy. But the characters and the situations they found themselves in were treated seriously, their tragic potential emphasized, in a way inappropriate to comedy hitherto. The genre acted in part as a vehicle and focus for the cult of sensibility and sensitive feeling that was an important component in the formation of a new, ascendant bourgeois culture. One of its major aims was to encourage audiences to empathize with its protagonists, to identify with their plights and dilemmas, to feel sorry for them, and to weep on their behalf, happy ending or not, rather than to laugh at them. Labels for the new genre tended to vary. It bore some resemblance to the older tradition of tragicomedy. It was sometimes called, simply, drame or drama. We would now call it melodrama. In France it was called comédie larmoyante, tearful comedy. This term is indicative not only of the extent to which comedy can be found and classified on the basis of criteria pertaining to narrative characteristics in general, and a happy ending in particular, but also of the extent to which the criteria, and the forms to which they refer, can exist separately from, at times even in contradiction to, those based on the generation of laughter. The theatrical provenance of comédie larmoyante, and of the theory that sustained it, is indicative of the extent to which definitions and theories of comedy have their basis in the theater, a point borne out by what is perhaps the most striking feature of the dictionary definition quoted above, its specification of comedy as a type of stage play. Many of these theatrically based theories, definitions, and forms have their roots in Aristotle's Poetics, and in the neoclassical theory and practice of the post-Renaissance period, which borrowed from Aristotle, and reworked and refined his ideas and formulations. For neoclassical theory, based as it was in an aristocratic cultural milieu, and concerned as it was to emulate the principles laid down in the Poetics, tended to erect a distinction between high and low comedy, and to promote the importance of narrative considerations in general, and the criterion of a happy ending in particular. It tended, as a corollary, to downplay or to denigrate non-narrative forms of comedy, and the importance of the criterion of laughter. Neoclassical concepts still have their uses, as we shall see in later chapters of this book. But the existence, and importance of non-narrative forms of comedy, whether historical, like the jig, or contemporary, like the stand-up routine, reveal the limitations both of neoclassical theory, and of the criterion of a happy ending. For, on the one hand, a happy ending necessitates a preceding narrative context, a context lacking, by definition, in non-narrative forms. On the other hand, non-narrative forms clearly qualify as comedy. They do so, however, not on the basis of the way they end, nor on the basis of any other structural features. They do so because, and only because, they are designed to make us laugh. They qualify as comedy on the basis of the very criterion neoclassicism tended, along with non-narrative forms themselves, to undervalue. This is a key point, not because of what it tells us about the limitations of neoclassical theory, but because of what it tells us about the heterogeneity of forms and conventions comedy can involve. It is indicative, in particular, of two sets of divisions which traverse the field of comedy as a whole, and which require very careful separation. One is the division between the criterion of a happy ending and the criterion of laughter. The other is the division between narrative and non-narrative forms. Although there tends, within neoclassical theory, to be a coincidence between them, the two kinds of division are logically distinct. Moreover, they do not always, in practice, correspond with or accompany one another. For while the criterion of laughter can apply only to narrative forms, and while non-narrative forms only qualify as comedy because of the criterion of laughter, the symmetry between the different forms and the different criteria is incomplete. The criterion of laughter is not, like the criterion of a happy ending, restricted to one type of form. It can apply to narratives, as well as to non-narrative forms like double acts and stand-up routine.